Have you ever felt so embarrassed that you wanted to disappear, just because you didn't understand something simple? When I first moved to the United States, I made one small mistake in a restaurant. I didn't leave a tip. What happened next was awkward, confusing, and unforgettable. But that moment didn't just teach me about tipping, it quietly changed my English, my confidence, and even my life. The day I didn't tip. Feeling embarrassed in a new country can be strangely powerful. Sometimes one small mistake, something that seems harmless, can suddenly make you question everything you thought you understood. When I first moved to the United States, I believed my biggest challenge would be English. Vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation. I practiced all of it for years. But the most unforgettable lesson I learned in America did not come from a classroom. It came from a restaurant bill, and the moment I walked away without leaving a tip. Picture the beginning of a new life. A new country. New streets. New sounds. New rules that no one explains directly. When I first arrived in the United States, everything felt exciting but also overwhelming at the same time. The supermarkets were enormous. The highways seemed endless. Even simple things like ordering coffee felt like a small performance. Language was everywhere. Fast, casual, relaxed English. Not the slow, careful sentences from textbooks. I had studied English for many years before arriving. I knew how to introduce myself. I knew how to ask questions politely. I even practiced listening to American podcasts and videos. But real life has a different rhythm. People speak faster. They shorten words. They smile and talk at the same time. And sometimes they follow rules that are completely invisible. One of those invisible rules is called tipping. At the beginning, I didn't really notice it. I saw small numbers printed on receipts in restaurants, 15%, 18%, 20%. I assumed those numbers were maybe related to taxes or optional fees. Nobody explained it to me. And honestly, I felt too shy to ask. There is something interesting about the human brain when we move to a new culture. Psychologists call it cultural overload. Your brain is processing hundreds of new signals every day: language, gestures, social behavior, money, transportation, work expectations. Because of that overload, the brain focuses on survival. It pays attention to what seems most important. For me, the most important thing was English. If I could understand conversations and respond politely, I felt safe. Everything else seemed secondary. That belief worked until one quiet evening. After finishing a long day at work, I decided to have dinner at a small restaurant near my apartment. Nothing fancy. Just a comfortable neighborhood place with soft lighting and wooden tables. The moment I walked in, I noticed something about American restaurants. The atmosphere often feels friendly and relaxed. People talk casually. Waiters and waitresses smile often. It feels less formal than restaurants in many other countries. A waitress approached my table and greeted me with a warm smile. "Hi there. How are you tonight?" For half a second, my brain translated the sentence automatically. Then I answered carefully. "I'm good. Thank you." She nodded and placed a menu on the table. "Take your time." Those 3 words felt welcoming. Take your time. No pressure. No rush. I remember thinking that Americans were very friendly. While looking at the menu, I quietly practiced the sentence in my head before ordering. Speaking English in public still made me nervous at that time. I wanted every word to sound clear. When the waitress returned, I spoke slowly. "I would like the chicken sandwich, please." Simple sentence. Correct grammar. Clear pronunciation. She wrote the order and smiled. Great choice. That small moment gave me confidence. Ordering food in English felt like passing a tiny test. The food arrived about 15 minutes later. The sandwich looked perfect: warm bread, melted cheese, and crispy fries on the side. The smell alone made me forget all my nervousness. I ate slowly, enjoying the quiet atmosphere of the restaurant. That dinner felt like a small victory. Living in America. Eating in an American restaurant. Speaking English with strangers. Everything seemed to be working. When I finished the meal, the waitress returned and placed a small black folder on the table. "Whenever you're ready," she said kindly. Inside the folder was the bill. The total was around $18. Simple enough. I took out my card, paid the amount, signed the receipt, and closed the folder. In my mind, the process was complete. Meal finished. Payment done. So I stood up, put on my jacket, and walked toward the door. But just before leaving, I noticed something strange. The waitress had picked up the receipt. She looked down at it, paused for a moment, and then glanced in my direction. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't rude either. It was more like surprise. That kind of expression that quietly asks a question without using words. For a second, my brain tried to understand what had happened. Did I say something wrong? Did I pronounce something badly? Did I forget to sign something? Everything seemed normal. So I stepped outside into the cool evening air, still slightly confused but mostly proud of myself. Dinner in English. Successful. Or at least, that's what I believed. Life has a funny sense of humor. Sometimes the most important lessons arrive when you are completely unaware that you made a mistake. Later that night, while talking with a coworker, I mentioned the restaurant. "I tried a new place today," I told him. "The food was really good." He smiled. "Nice. Did you tip?" That word stopped me immediately. "Tip?" I asked. He raised his eyebrows. "Yeah, the tip for the server." Slowly, I shook my head. "No. I just paid the bill." For a moment, he stared at me. Then a small laugh escaped. Not a cruel laugh. More like the laugh of someone remembering their own first mistake in America. "Oh man," he said gently. "You didn't leave a tip?" And in that quiet moment, I realized something important. Learning English is not only about vocabulary. It is about understanding culture. It is about knowing the invisible rules that everyone else seems to understand automatically. And that night, sitting there with my coworker, I suddenly understood that my first embarrassing cultural lesson in America had just begun. What I didn't know yet was that this tiny mistake, walking out of a restaurant without tipping, would lead to conversations, friendships, and even a relationship that would slowly change my life in this country. A small misunderstanding, but a very big story. Arriving in America with big dreams. Stepping into a new country can feel like pressing the reset button on your entire life. New streets, new sounds, new expectations. When my plane landed in the United States for the first time, I remember looking out the airport window and thinking something simple but powerful. This is where my new story begins. Like many people who come to America, I arrived with big dreams and a suitcase full of hope. I imagined opportunities, growth, and a life where hard work could truly change the future. But no one talks enough about the quiet challenges that appear in everyday moments, especially when language and culture mix together in unexpected ways. The airport itself already felt like a different world. People walked quickly with rolling suitcases, announcements echoed through the terminal, and conversations in English flowed all around me. I understood many words, but not everything. Sometimes a sentence passed by like a fast train, there for a second, gone the next. Researchers who study language learning often explain something interesting. Understanding a language in a classroom and understanding it in real life are two completely different experiences. In a classroom, sentences are slow and organized. In real life, people interrupt each other, laugh mid-sentence, shorten words, and use expressions that rarely appear in textbooks. That difference hit me almost immediately. The first few weeks in America felt like living inside a giant listening exercise. Everywhere I went, my brain was working overtime. At grocery stores, I tried to follow conversations between customers and cashiers. On the bus, I listened to strangers chatting about work, sports, or weekend plans. Sometimes I caught the meaning. Sometimes I only caught fragments. But something surprising happened during that time. The more I listened to real conversations, the more natural English began to sound. Not perfect. Not easy. But familiar. Scientists call this process passive language absorption. When the brain hears repeated patterns, common phrases, everyday expressions, it slowly begins to predict meaning even before every word is clear. In simple terms, the brain starts learning English the same way children do, by hearing it in real life. And real life, of course, includes restaurants. During my early months in the United States, eating out became one of my favorite ways to observe American culture. Restaurants were like small social laboratories. People talked freely, laughed loudly, and treated waiters and waitresses in ways that were different from what I was used to. One detail always stood out. Servers often returned to the table several times during a meal. How is everything? Can I get you anything else? More water? At first I thought they were simply being extra polite. Later I learned that these small interactions were part of something deeper in American culture, service and appreciation. But remember, at that point I still didn't fully understand the system behind it. And that misunderstanding eventually led to my unforgettable tipping mistake. Before that embarrassing night at the restaurant, my daily routine was slowly taking shape. I had started working at a small company where most of my coworkers were American. They were friendly, patient, and surprisingly curious about my background. Lunch breaks became my unofficial English class. Someone would ask, "So what food do you miss from home?" Another person might ask, "What's the weather like in your country?" Those questions turned into conversations. Sometimes simple, sometimes confusing, but always useful. Every day I learned new expressions. For example, one coworker once said, "Don't worry about it. You'll get the hang of things." That phrase, "get the hang of things," confused me at first. What exactly was the hang? But over time I realized that many English expressions are not meant to be translated word by word. They are feelings wrapped inside language. Little by little, those feelings began to make sense. Still, living in a new culture can sometimes feel like walking through a room where everyone else already knows the rules of the game. They move confidently. They understand the signals. Meanwhile, you are quietly watching, learning, trying not to make mistakes. Psychologists often call this stage cultural adjustment. At first there is excitement. Everything feels new and interesting. Then confusion appears. Why do people do things this way? Why does this rule exist? But if someone stays curious instead of frustrated, something beautiful happens. Understanding begins to grow. Looking back now, I realize that my biggest progress in English did not happen while studying grammar. It happened during small everyday moments, buying coffee, asking for directions, chatting with coworkers, or ordering food at restaurants. Each conversation was like a tiny brick in a much larger wall of confidence. Of course, confidence doesn't appear overnight. At that time, I was still nervous when speaking English with strangers. My sentences were careful and sometimes slow. But every successful interaction gave me a little more courage. That courage is what led me to visit that small neighborhood restaurant one evening. The place looked warm and welcoming. Soft music played in the background. The smell of grilled food filled the air. It seemed like the perfect place to practice my English again. I had no idea that this simple dinner would soon turn into one of the most embarrassing and most educational moments of my life in America. Because hidden behind the friendly smiles and delicious food was a cultural rule I still didn't understand. A rule that would surprise me, confuse me, and eventually teach me something far more valuable than grammar. Sometimes the best lessons in a new country don't come from books. They come from real life, and occasionally from a restaurant receipt. English outside the classroom. A strange thing happens when you move to a new country. The language you studied for years suddenly feels different. The words are the same, the grammar rules are the same, but the way people use them feels completely alive. In textbooks, English is clean and organized. In real life, English breathes, laughs, interrupts itself, and sometimes runs faster than your brain can follow. That realization slowly became clear during my first months in the United States. Back home, my English learning routine had been very structured. I studied vocabulary lists. I practiced grammar exercises. I listened to recordings where speakers pronounced every word carefully. Everything had order. Everything had rules. But outside the classroom, English behaves more like a living creature. People shorten sentences. They speak while smiling. They pause in the middle of thoughts. Sometimes they even change direction halfway through a sentence. At first, this felt frustrating. For example, someone might say something like, "Yeah, I kinda thought it was gonna be like, different." Grammatically, that sentence is a puzzle. But emotionally, Americans understand it instantly. Linguists often explain that natural conversation depends more on shared context than perfect grammar. In other words, people understand meaning not just through words, but through tone, rhythm, facial expressions, and situation. And the best place to observe that natural language? Coffee shops. One afternoon, a few weeks after my embarrassing restaurant experience, I stopped by a small cafe near my workplace. It wasn't a big chain store. It was one of those cozy neighborhood places where people bring laptops, read books, or chat with friends for hours. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Soft indie music played quietly from the speakers. Sunlight came through the windows and warmed the wooden tables. I ordered a simple drink. A small latte, please. The barista nodded and asked, "For here or to go?" That question confused me the first time I heard it weeks earlier. But now I understood. "For here," I replied. Small victories like that felt surprisingly satisfying. While waiting for my coffee, I sat at a table near the window and opened my notebook. At that time, I had a small habit that helped my English improve quickly. Whenever I heard a new expression in conversation, I wrote it down. Not long definitions. Just the phrase. Later, I would try to use it myself. That day, however, something unexpected happened. A woman sitting at the table next to me noticed my notebook. She looked over and smiled. "Are you studying?" she asked. For a moment, I hesitated. Talking to strangers still made me nervous. But then I nodded. "Yes. I'm learning English." She laughed softly, not in a rude way, but in a friendly, curious way. "Your English sounds pretty good already." That sentence surprised me. My brain immediately searched for the right response. "Thank you," I said slowly. "I still make many mistakes." She shrugged gently. "Everyone does." That simple reply carried a surprising amount of wisdom. Everyone does. Even native speakers make mistakes. Even people born into the language struggle with words sometimes. Hearing that made me relax a little. Her name was Emily. Emily worked as a graphic designer nearby, and she often visited that cafe during the afternoon. What started as a short conversation about language quickly turned into something more interesting. She asked where I was from. I asked how long she had lived in the city. Our sentences were simple, but the conversation felt natural. Sometimes I paused to find the right word. Sometimes she spoke a little slower when she noticed I was thinking. That kind of adjustment is something kind people often do automatically. Communication, after all, is teamwork. Researchers studying language learning have discovered something fascinating. When learners practice speaking with supportive conversation partners, their confidence grows much faster than through study alone. The brain learns not only words, but emotional safety. And emotional safety encourages risk. During that conversation, I tried new sentences. Not perfect sentences, but honest ones. At one point Emily asked, "So what made you move to the United States?" I thought for a moment before answering. "I wanted a new start," I said. "And maybe a better future." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's a pretty good reason." We talked about food, work, weather, and cultural differences. Some topics were easy. Others required more explanation. But something important happened during that conversation. For the first time since arriving in America, speaking English didn't feel like a test. It felt like connection. There is a huge psychological difference between those two experiences. When language feels like a test, the brain focuses on avoiding mistakes. Fear becomes the main emotion. When language feels like connection, the brain focuses on meaning. Curiosity replaces fear. That afternoon in the cafe lasted almost an hour. Eventually Emily looked at the time and laughed. I should probably get back to work, she said. Before leaving, she added something simple but encouraging. You know, the best way to improve English is exactly what you're doing. I tilted my head slightly. Drinking coffee? I joked. She smiled. Talking to people. That sentence stayed in my mind long after she left the cafe. Talking to people. Not memorizing endless grammar rules. Not worrying about perfect pronunciation. Just real conversations. Looking back now, that moment was the beginning of something important. That cafe conversation didn't just help my English. It slowly introduced a friendship, and eventually something deeper. But at the time, I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that I had found a new place to practice English, a friendly conversation partner, and a small spark of confidence growing inside me. And strangely enough, the same cultural confusion that had embarrassed me at the restaurant was about to return again in a completely unexpected way. Because soon, Emily would invite me to dinner. And this time, tipping would become impossible to ignore. The embarrassing dinner night. Some moments in life begin quietly and then slowly turn into unforgettable memories. Not because something dramatic happens, but because a small misunderstanding reveals a much bigger lesson. The dinner Emily invited me to would become exactly that kind of moment. A few days after our first long conversation at the cafe, I returned there again after work. The place already felt familiar. The warm smell of coffee, the soft music, the low conversations around the room, it had started to feel like a comfortable corner of my new life in America. Emily was already sitting at the same table near the window, typing on her laptop. When she saw me walk in, she waved. Hey. English student, she joked. I laughed and walked over. Hello, teacher, I replied. That small joke immediately broke the awkwardness. Humor is one of the fastest bridges between people, even when language skills are still developing. We talked again about many simple things. Work. Food. Weather. Movies. Conversations like this might sound ordinary, but for someone learning a new language, they are powerful practice. Every sentence forces the brain to process vocabulary, grammar, tone, and timing at the same time. After about 20 minutes, Emily closed her laptop and looked at me thoughtfully. Have you had dinner yet? She asked. I shook my head. Not yet. She smiled. There's a really good place down the street. Want to try it? For a brief moment, my brain hesitated. Eating dinner with someone meant more conversation. More English. More chances to make mistakes. But it also meant more learning. So I nodded. Sure. We walked together along the street, passing small shops and glowing streetlights. Evening traffic moved slowly, and people were finishing their workdays. The air felt cool and comfortable. The restaurant she chose looked lively but not too crowded. Inside, the atmosphere felt warm and casual. Families talked over dinner. Friends laughed at nearby tables. Plates clinked gently as servers moved around the room. A host greeted us and led us to a table. Once again, the familiar ritual of American restaurants began. A waiter approached with menus and a friendly smile. Hi folks, how's it going tonight? Emily answered naturally. Good, thanks. Then she looked at me and said, this place has amazing burgers." The menu looked simple enough. That made me feel relieved. Ordering complicated dishes in English was still stressful at that time. But a burger felt safe. When the waiter returned, Emily ordered first. "I'll have the classic burger with fries." Then he looked at me. "And for you?" I took a small breath. "I would like the same, please." "Great choice," he said, writing it down. Again, that little phrase, "great choice," felt encouraging. While waiting for the food, the conversation continued. Emily asked about my first months in America. I shared stories about learning English at work, getting lost on buses, and trying new foods. At one point she laughed and said something interesting. "You're brave." I blinked in surprise. "Why?" "Moving to a new country isn't easy," she explained. "A lot of people talk about doing it, but not many actually try." That comment stayed with me. Sometimes we are so focused on our struggles that we forget how far we've already come. The food arrived soon after. The burgers looked incredible: juicy meat, melted cheese, crispy fries. For a while, the conversation paused as we both focused on eating. Halfway through the meal, the waiter returned to check on us. "How's everything tasting?" Emily answered easily. "Really good." I nodded. "Yes, very good." These small interactions may seem unimportant, but they are actually powerful language practice. Repeating common phrases in real situations helps the brain remember them naturally. The dinner felt relaxed and enjoyable. Talking with Emily didn't feel like studying English anymore. It felt like sharing time with a friend. Eventually the meal ended, and the waiter placed the bill on the table. This moment, so simple and ordinary, was about to become the center of my next cultural lesson. Emily reached for the bill. "I got it," she said casually. I quickly shook my head. No. Let's share." In many cultures, offering to split the bill is polite. It shows fairness and respect. She smiled. "Okay." The total came to about $40. Emily paid with her card and placed the receipt back on the table. Then she picked up a pen and wrote something on it before putting the folder near the edge of the table. I watched the motion but didn't fully understand it. A minute later we stood up to leave. As we walked outside, something curious happened. Emily suddenly paused. "Wait a second," she said. She turned around and walked quickly back inside the restaurant. I stood on the sidewalk, confused. A minute passed. Then 2. Finally she returned. Everything seemed normal, but there was a small smile on her face, one of those smiles people use when they are trying to be polite about something awkward. "What happened?" I asked. "Oh, nothing," she said lightly. "I just forgot something." We continued walking down the street, but my brain was already replaying the moment. Something about that situation felt strange. A few minutes later, curiosity won. "Can I ask something?" I said. "Of course." "When you wrote on the receipt, what was that?" She looked at me with mild surprise. "That was the tip." The word again. Tip. My brain suddenly connected the dots. "You mean extra money?" I asked slowly. She nodded. "Yes. For the server." I felt my stomach drop slightly. Oh. She studied my face carefully. Wait, she said gently. You didn't know about tipping? In that moment, the embarrassment returned. Not as a loud shock, but as a quiet realization. The same mistake that confused me days earlier had just appeared again. Only this time, someone was there to explain it. And that explanation was about to change the way I understood American culture forever. Why tipping matters in America. Standing on the sidewalk that evening, the city lights glowing softly around us, I realized something important. Sometimes the most confusing parts of a new culture are not the language, the food, or even the laws. The most confusing parts are the invisible habits that everyone follows without thinking. Tipping in the United States is one of those habits. When Emily asked, "You didn't know about tipping?" I felt that familiar wave of embarrassment again. Not the kind that ruins your day, but the kind that makes you suddenly aware of how much you still have to learn. I shook my head slowly. No. I thought the price on the bill was everything. Emily nodded thoughtfully. She didn't laugh or make me feel stupid. Instead, she leaned against a streetlight and began explaining something that most Americans grow up understanding automatically. Well, she said gently, in the U.S., tipping is part of how many service workers earn their income. At first, the idea seemed strange to me. In my country, I explained, people just pay the bill. The restaurant pays the workers. That still happens here, she replied. But many servers receive a smaller base salary. Tips make up a big part of what they actually earn. That explanation changed the situation completely. Suddenly tipping wasn't just a polite gesture. It was part of the system. Economists often explain tipping as a cultural agreement between customers and service workers. Restaurants keep menu prices slightly lower, but customers voluntarily add extra money to reward good service. In practice, it creates a kind of partnership. The server works hard to give good service, and the customer recognizes that effort through the tip. Emily continued walking as she talked, and I followed beside her, listening carefully. Most people tip around 15 to 20%, she explained. 20%? I repeated, surprised. She smiled. Yeah. Sometimes more if the service is great. My brain immediately began calculating numbers. If the bill is $20, 20% would be about $4. If the bill is $50, the tip might be $10. For someone unfamiliar with the system, it can feel confusing at first. But for Americans, the math becomes automatic. There's even psychological research behind tipping behavior. Studies show that when people feel appreciated by service workers, through friendliness, eye contact, or good conversation, they are more likely to leave larger tips. In other words, tipping is not only about money. It's about human interaction. Servers remember regular customers. Customers appreciate friendly service. Over time, small relationships form between strangers who may only meet for a few minutes. While Emily explained all this, I thought back to the waitress from my earlier restaurant visit, the one who looked surprised when she saw my receipt. Suddenly her expression made sense. I hadn't just skipped an optional extra payment. From her perspective, I had accidentally ignored part of the social contract of the restaurant. That must happen a lot with people visiting the U.S., I said quietly. Emily nodded. Yeah, actually. tourists sometimes forget. Or they just don't know. That answer made me feel a little better. Cultural misunderstandings are surprisingly common. Sociologists call these moments cultural friction. Two systems of habits collide, and someone gets confused, not because they are careless, but because they were raised with different expectations. Learning a new culture often means slowly discovering these hidden expectations. We reached a small park bench and sat down for a moment. The city felt peaceful at night, and cars passed quietly in the distance. Emily looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "You know something interesting," she said. "What?" "You didn't do anything wrong intentionally. You just didn't know the rule yet." That sentence carried a lot of kindness. Many people fear making mistakes while learning a language or adapting to a new culture. They worry about embarrassment. They worry about judgment. But the truth is much simpler. Mistakes are part of the learning process. Language experts often say that real progress begins the moment a learner stops trying to be perfect and starts being curious instead. That night, curiosity replaced my embarrassment. I began asking questions. "So do people always tip?" I asked. "Almost always in restaurants," Emily explained. "Also in places like bars, taxis, hair salons, anywhere someone provides personal service." "Is it always 20%? "Usually somewhere between 15 and 20, she said. "People adjust depending on the experience." The more she explained, the more the system made sense. And something else happened too. My English improved during that conversation without me even noticing. Listening carefully, asking questions, responding naturally, this is exactly how real language development works. Researchers studying second language learning call this meaningful interaction. When the brain focuses on understanding ideas instead of memorizing grammar, language skills grow faster and more naturally. By the time we stood up to leave the park bench, my earlier embarrassment had transformed into something else. Understanding. Cultural learning works exactly like language learning. At first everything feels confusing. Then patterns slowly appear. Eventually those patterns become habits. Before we said goodbye for the night, Emily smiled and added one more thing. "Don't worry," she said. "Your first tipping mistake probably won't be your last." I laughed. "Hopefully I improve quickly." "Oh, you will," she said confidently. What I didn't realize at that moment was how right she was. Because the lesson about tipping wasn't finished yet. In fact, the most meaningful part of the story, the moment that would truly change how I saw kindness, work, and American culture, was still waiting for me inside another restaurant. And the person who would teach that lesson would be someone I least expected. A kind waiter changed my thinking. Some lessons arrive slowly, like a quiet sunrise. Others appear in a single unexpected conversation. After learning about tipping from Emily, I believed I finally understood the system. Leave 15 to 20%. Show appreciation. Respect the work of the server. Simple enough. But understanding a rule and truly understanding the people behind that rule are two very different things. A few weeks later, I found myself back in another restaurant after work. This time, I was determined not to repeat my earlier mistake. My confidence had grown a little since that embarrassing night. I could order food without rehearsing every word in my head, and conversations with strangers didn't feel as frightening anymore. The restaurant was a small family-style place, not too crowded, with soft yellow lights and the comforting smell of grilled chicken and fresh bread. Places like this often feel more personal than large restaurants. You can hear the laughter from nearby tables. The servers sometimes remember regular customers. A waiter approached my table with a relaxed smile. "Evening. What can I get started for you?" His tone was casual but friendly, the kind of natural conversation style Americans use every day. I looked at the menu for a moment and then answered. "I'll have the chicken pasta, please." "Good choice," he said, writing it down. "Anything to drink?" "Just water, thank you." "Coming right up." The interaction felt simple, but something about the waiter stood out. He seemed genuinely cheerful, not the forced politeness you sometimes see in busy service environments. When he returned with my food, he asked the usual question. "How's everything tasting?" "Very good," I replied. He gave a quick thumbs up and moved to the next table. While eating, I found myself observing the rhythm of the restaurant. Servers moving between tables, customers chatting, plates arriving and disappearing. There was a quiet teamwork happening everywhere. And suddenly, I remembered Emily's explanation. Tipping isn't just extra money. It's appreciation. That idea changed the way I looked at the room. Before, I saw waiters simply as employees doing their job. Now I began to notice the effort behind that job. The constant walking. The quick memory needed to track multiple orders. The emotional skill of staying polite and friendly with every customer. Psychologists call this ability emotional labor. Service workers often manage their emotions as part of their job, staying patient, positive, and attentive even during stressful moments. That kind of work can be exhausting. When I finished eating, the waiter brought the bill. "Whenever you're ready," he said. This time, I paid close attention to the receipt. At the bottom were the familiar suggested tip percentages, 15%, 18%, and 20%. I picked up the pen and carefully calculated the amount. My math wasn't perfect, but I tried my best. Before leaving, however, something unexpected happened. The waiter returned to the table just as I was finishing the receipt. "Hey," he said casually, noticing my accent. "Where are you from?" I hesitated for a second before answering. "I moved here recently." He smiled. "Welcome to the U.S." That small sentence carried warmth. Sometimes simple words can make a new place feel more welcoming. We talked briefly while he cleared the table. "Still getting used to everything?" he asked. "Yes," I admitted. "Especially the tipping system." He laughed gently. "Yeah, that one surprises a lot of people." His reaction wasn't judgmental. It felt more like shared understanding. Then he said something that stayed with me for a long time. "You know, tips really make a difference for us." I looked up with curiosity. "How?" He leaned lightly against the edge of the table, lowering his voice slightly as if sharing a small secret of the restaurant world. "A lot of people don't realize this, but servers depend on tips for most of their income," he explained. "Without tips, the job would be really hard to survive on." He wasn't complaining. His tone remained calm and matter-of-fact. "But when someone leaves a good tip," he continued, "it tells us that our effort mattered." That sentence changed the meaning of tipping for me completely. It wasn't just part of the payment system. It was communication. A tip was a silent message: I noticed your work. In behavioral economics, researchers often discuss how small gestures of appreciation influence motivation. When people feel recognized for their effort, even through small rewards, their job satisfaction increases significantly. That principle applies everywhere, but in service jobs it becomes especially visible. The waiter noticed the number I had written on the receipt and nodded with a friendly smile. "Thank you," he said sincerely. Not a scripted thank you, but a real one. And in that moment, something clicked inside my mind. Earlier, tipping had felt like a confusing rule I needed to remember. Now it felt like a simple act of respect. Before leaving, the waiter added one more thing. "Don't worry," he said. "Everyone learns the system eventually." I laughed. "I already made the mistake once." He chuckled. "Then you're officially part of the club." Walking out of the restaurant that night, I felt different than before. The embarrassment I once felt about tipping had transformed into understanding. Sometimes cultural lessons arrive through kindness rather than criticism. And sometimes a short conversation with a stranger can change the way you see an entire system. That waiter probably forgot our conversation by the next day. For him, it was just another table, another customer, another evening shift. But for me, that moment became another step in my journey of understanding life in America. Language, culture, work, and respect, all quietly connected through a small line on a restaurant receipt. And strangely enough, the more I understood these small cultural details, the more comfortable my English began to feel. Because language isn't only about speaking correctly. It's about understanding the people you're speaking with. Learning English through real life. There is a quiet moment in every language learner's journey when something unexpected happens. The language stops feeling like a subject and starts feeling like a tool for living. That moment usually doesn't happen inside a classroom. It happens somewhere ordinary, at a cafe table, in a grocery store line, or during a casual conversation with someone you barely know. For me, that moment began after the tipping lessons I had learned in those restaurants. At first, I thought those experiences were simply cultural mistakes. Small embarrassing moments that I would laugh about later. But something interesting started happening in my daily life after that. My English began improving faster. Not because I studied harder. Because I started paying attention differently. Language researchers often explain that real fluency grows through context. When the brain connects words to real experiences, real emotions, real people, real situations, it remembers those words much longer. Grammar rules can fade, but memories stay. And my life in the United States was quickly filling with new memories. One afternoon after work, I returned to the cafe where Emily and I had first spoken. It had become a comfortable routine. I would order a coffee, sit near the window, and listen to conversations around me. That cafe was like a live English classroom. At one table, two coworkers were discussing a project deadline. At another, a couple was debating what movie to watch that night. Near the counter, someone was explaining travel plans to a friend. Each conversation had its own rhythm. Some sentences were fast. Others were slow. People laughed, interrupted each other, paused to think. It was messy, natural language, the kind no textbook can perfectly capture. I opened my notebook again, but this time I wrote less. Instead of collecting vocabulary, I focused on understanding the flow of conversation. Linguists call this pattern recognition. The brain begins noticing common structures, how people start stories, how they react to surprises, how they agree or disagree politely. For example, Americans often respond with short phrases like, "Yeah, I know what you mean. That makes sense. No way." These expressions may seem simple, but they are powerful tools for conversation. They show engagement. They keep the dialogue moving. As I listened to people around me, I began practicing these responses quietly in my mind. Not perfect grammar. Just natural reactions. Suddenly, English felt less like a complicated system of rules and more like a dance between people. That afternoon, Emily walked into the cafe again. She spotted me near the window and smiled. "Look who's back," she said, sitting down. "My favorite study place," I replied. She glanced at my notebook. "Still collecting English phrases?" "Not exactly," I said. "Now I'm studying people." She laughed. "That's actually the best way to learn." Our conversation flowed more easily than before. Something had changed inside my mind. Instead of translating every sentence, I was beginning to understand meaning directly. This shift is something language scientists call thinking in the target language. When learners stop translating each word and start processing ideas naturally, fluency accelerates. Of course, I still made mistakes. At one point during the conversation, I accidentally used the wrong word while describing my job. Emily corrected me gently, and we both laughed. But the mistake didn't bother me anymore. Psychologists studying adult learning often say that embarrassment is one of the biggest barriers to progress. When people fear making mistakes, their brain becomes defensive. It avoids risk, which slows learning. Once that fear disappears, curiosity takes its place. And curiosity is powerful. Emily noticed the change too. "You seem more relaxed speaking English now," she said. "I think I'm finally understanding something important," I replied. "What's that?" "Language is not only words. It's situations." She nodded. "Exactly." Then she added something interesting. "You know, a lot of people who move to a new country try to hide from uncomfortable situations. They stay quiet, spend time only with people from their own culture, and avoid speaking the new language." "That sounds safe," I admitted. "It feels safe," she said. "But it slows everything down." Her point made sense. Growth often happens outside comfortable spaces. Every time I ordered food, asked for directions, or started a conversation with a stranger, my brain gained a little more confidence. The tipping mistake had actually helped with that. It forced me to ask questions. It forced me to understand the culture behind the language. In other words, it turned passive learning into active learning. That small shift changed everything. Now, when I entered a restaurant or cafe, I didn't just see menus and tables. I saw opportunities to practice listening, speaking, and observing. Even simple phrases became meaningful. "How's it going?" "Take your time." "Anything else I can get you?" These everyday expressions formed the real foundation of communication. Language experts sometimes call them high-frequency social phrases. They appear in thousands of daily interactions, which makes them extremely valuable for learners. By using these phrases naturally, conversations become smoother. And smoother conversations lead to stronger connections. Emily finished her coffee and leaned back in her chair. You know, she said thoughtfully, your story about the tipping mistake is actually kind of perfect. Perfect? I laughed. It was embarrassing. Yeah, she said. But it made you curious instead of discouraged. She was right. That small moment of confusion had pushed me into deeper understanding. It had taught me about American culture, improved my English, and introduced me to conversations that might never have happened otherwise. Sometimes the most useful lessons hide inside uncomfortable experiences. And as strange as it sounds, that awkward restaurant moment was slowly becoming one of the best things that happened during my first year in America. Because it reminded me of something simple but powerful. Real language learning doesn't happen when life is easy. It happens when life is real. Love growing in small conversations. Most people imagine that love begins with something dramatic. A big moment. A sudden spark. A perfect line from a movie. But in real life, love often grows quietly, almost invisibly, inside small conversations that repeat over time. Looking back, that is exactly what happened with Emily and me. At first, we were simply two people sharing coffee and practicing conversation. Nothing complicated. No pressure. Just ordinary afternoons in a small cafe where the sunlight touched the tables and the smell of roasted beans filled the air. But ordinary moments have a strange power. Psychologists who study relationships often say that emotional connection grows through something called microinteractions. These are small, repeated exchanges, eye contact, shared laughter, simple questions about daily life. Over time, these tiny moments build familiarity and trust. Our cafe conversations slowly turned into that kind of pattern. One afternoon, Emily arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. She placed one in front of me. I guessed your order, she said. I looked at the cup. A latte? She nodded. You always order the same thing. I laughed. Now you know my routine. Everyone has one, she said. Routines are interesting things. At first they seem boring, but in relationships they create comfort. When 2 people begin to recognize each other's habits, favorite drinks, usual jokes, the way they tell stories, it means familiarity is growing. Our conversations had also become smoother. Months earlier, I had needed extra time to form every sentence in English. Now the words came more naturally. Not perfectly, but comfortably enough that I could focus on ideas instead of grammar. Language researchers call this stage communicative fluency. It doesn't mean the language is perfect. It means communication flows without constant mental effort. That change allowed our conversations to explore deeper topics. One afternoon, Emily asked a question that surprised me. Do you ever miss home? The cafe was quieter than usual that day. Outside, a light rain tapped against the windows. I thought carefully before answering. Yes, I said slowly. Sometimes. What do you miss the most? I smiled slightly. Family dinners. She nodded, waiting for me to continue. In my family, I explained, everyone talks at the same time. It's noisy. People laugh, argue, tell stories. That sounds fun, she said. It is, I replied. But also exhausting. She laughed. Sounds like my family too. Moments like that reveal something important. Cultures may look different on the surface, but human experiences are often surprisingly similar. Family. Food. Work. Dreams. These themes connect people across languages. During another conversation, Emily asked about my early experiences in America. So besides the tipping confusion, she teased, what else surprised you here? I leaned back and thought for a moment. The friendliness, I said. Really? Yes. People talk to strangers more here. She nodded thoughtfully. That's true in some places. Back home, I continued, people are friendly too, but conversations with strangers happen less often. Emily smiled. Well, if strangers didn't talk here, we wouldn't have met. That sentence made me pause for a moment. She was right. A simple conversation in a cafe had slowly turned into something meaningful. Relationship experts often explain that strong connections grow from repeated positive interactions. Each conversation builds emotional memory. Each shared experience strengthens familiarity. Without realizing it, Emily and I had created dozens of these small shared moments. Coffee afternoons. Short walks after work. Stories about embarrassing cultural misunderstandings. Even the tipping story had become one of our favorite jokes. Sometimes Emily would ask playfully, "Did you remember the tip this time?" And I would answer proudly, "Always." Humor like that is a powerful bonding tool. When two people can laugh about past mistakes together, it creates a feeling of partnership. Another change also began happening around that time. Our conversations extended beyond the cafe. One evening we walked through a nearby park after dinner. The sky was turning orange with sunset, and the air felt calm. We talked about future plans. Emily asked, "Where do you see yourself in a few years?" That question felt big. "I hope to build a stable life here," I said. "Work, maybe a family someday." She looked thoughtful. That sounds like a good plan. Then she asked quietly, "Do you feel like America is starting to feel like home?" The question surprised me. A few months earlier, I would have said no without hesitation. Everything had felt unfamiliar and temporary. But things had changed. I had learned how restaurants worked. I had coworkers who shared jokes with me during lunch. I had favorite places to drink coffee. And I had someone sitting beside me on that park bench who understood my stories. "Yes," I said slowly. "It's starting to." Emily smiled softly. Language experts sometimes say that true fluency happens when a language becomes connected to emotion. Not just information, but feelings, friendship, laughter, even love. That evening in the park, English was no longer just the language I studied. It had become the language where new memories were forming. The tipping confusion that once embarrassed me had unexpectedly opened the door to something deeper, understanding, friendship, and a growing connection. But our story was about to face another challenge. Because meeting friends is easy. Meeting family is a completely different experience. And soon, Emily would invite me to do exactly that. Family, culture, and acceptance. Meeting someone's family can feel like stepping onto a completely different stage. Until that moment, your relationship exists in a comfortable bubble, shared jokes, quiet conversations, familiar routines. But family introduces something new: history, traditions, and expectations. For me, that moment arrived on a calm Saturday afternoon. Emily and I had been spending time together for several months by then. Coffee conversations had turned into regular dinners, weekend walks, and long talks about work and life. Somewhere along the way, our friendship had quietly grown into something deeper. Then one evening she said something that made my heart beat a little faster. "My parents are having dinner this Sunday," she said casually. "They'd love to meet you." The words sounded simple. But inside my head, 1,000 thoughts began racing. Meeting the family is always a big step in any culture. But when you come from another country, when you speak the language with an accent, when you are still learning the social rules, it feels even more significant. I nodded slowly. "I would like that," I said. Inside, however, I was already preparing for a new kind of challenge. Language learning experts often say that the most difficult conversations are not about vocabulary. They are about emotional pressure. When the stakes feel high, the brain becomes more cautious. Words that usually come easily suddenly feel harder to find. That Sunday afternoon, I arrived at Emily's parents' house carrying a small dessert I had bought from a local bakery. It was something simple but polite. In many cultures, bringing a small gift when visiting someone's home shows appreciation. The house itself looked warm and welcoming. A small garden sat in front of the porch, and the smell of something cooking drifted through the open door. Emily greeted me with a reassuring smile. "Relax," she whispered. "They're nice." I laughed quietly. "I'm more nervous about my English than about them." She shook her head. "You'll be fine." Inside, her parents welcomed me with genuine friendliness. Her father shook my hand firmly. "Good to meet you," he said. Her mother smiled warmly and said, "Emily has told us a lot about you." Those words were comforting. Friendly families often make the effort to create a relaxed atmosphere for guests. We sat at the dining table, and soon the conversation began. At first the topics were simple. Where I was from. What kind of work I did. How long I had lived in the United States. These questions were familiar territory. I had answered them many times before, so my responses felt natural. But then her father asked something that made everyone laugh. "So Emily tells us you had an interesting experience with tipping when you first arrived." I felt my face warm slightly. "That story is becoming famous," I joked. Emily laughed. "It's a great story." Her mother leaned forward with curiosity. "What happened?" So I told them. I explained my first restaurant visit, the confusion about the receipt, the surprised look from the waitress. I described how Emily later explained the tipping culture and how a waiter had shared his perspective about the importance of tips. While telling the story, something surprising happened. Everyone laughed, not at me, but with me. Her father nodded understandingly. "You're not the first person to experience that," he said. Her mother added, "Honestly, even some Americans get confused about tipping sometimes." That reaction changed the emotional tone immediately. Instead of feeling embarrassed, the story became a shared moment of humor. Sociologists often explain that humor plays an important role in cultural acceptance. When people laugh together about misunderstandings, the difference between insider and outsider becomes smaller. Dinner continued with stories about family traditions, travel experiences, and favorite foods. At one point, Emily's mother asked something thoughtful. "What has been the biggest challenge about living here?" I paused before answering. "Understanding the small cultural things," I said honestly. "Like tipping?" her father joked. "Yes," I said with a smile. "But also many small habits. How people communicate, how they show politeness." Her mother nodded knowingly. "Those things are invisible until someone points them out." She was exactly right. Culture often operates silently. People follow its rules without consciously thinking about them. But when someone from another background enters that environment, those hidden rules suddenly become visible. Dinner that evening felt warm and comfortable. Conversation flowed naturally. My English wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was connection. Psychologists who study intercultural relationships often highlight one key factor for success: curiosity. When people are curious about each other's backgrounds instead of suspicious of differences, understanding grows quickly. Emily's family showed that kind of curiosity. By the end of the evening, the nervous tension I had felt earlier had completely disappeared. As we stood near the door preparing to leave, her father smiled and said something simple but meaningful. "You're always welcome here." Those 4 words carried a powerful sense of acceptance. Outside, the evening air felt cool and peaceful. Emily and I walked slowly toward the car. "Well," she asked. "That went better than I expected," I admitted. She laughed. "See? I told you." Then she added something thoughtful. "You know, the tipping story actually helped." "How?" I asked. "It showed them who you are," she said. "Someone willing to learn." Her words stayed with me during the quiet drive home. Life in a new country often feels like solving a puzzle made of language, culture, and relationships. Piece by piece, understanding grows. And sometimes a small embarrassing mistake, like forgetting to leave a tip, becomes the beginning of connections you never expected. But the story still wasn't finished. Because a few weeks later, I would return to the very restaurant where my confusion had first begun. And this time, everything would feel completely different. Returning to that restaurant. Some places hold memories the moment you walk through the door. A certain table, a familiar smell, the sound of dishes clinking softly in the background. Months after my first embarrassing tipping mistake, I found myself standing outside the same restaurant where it had all started. It wasn't planned at first. Emily and I had just finished watching a movie downtown one evening. The streets were busy with people heading to dinner, music drifting from nearby bars, and warm lights glowing through restaurant windows. As we walked down the block, I suddenly recognized the sign above the door. "That's the place," I said. Emily looked up. "The famous tipping restaurant?" I nodded. "Exactly." She smiled with curiosity. "Well, should we go in?" For a moment, I hesitated. Memory has a strange way of bringing back old emotions. I could almost see the earlier version of myself sitting inside, carefully ordering food, confidently paying the bill, and walking out without realizing I had broken an invisible cultural rule. That version of me felt so different now. "Yeah," I said finally. "Let's go." Inside, the restaurant looked almost exactly the same. The same wooden tables, the same soft lighting, the same comfortable atmosphere. It was busy but not crowded. Conversations blended together into the gentle background noise that every restaurant seems to create. A hostess greeted us and guided us to a table. As I sat down, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling nervous, I felt calm. Language researchers sometimes talk about confidence loops. When someone repeatedly succeeds in small communication situations, their brain begins expecting success instead of failure. That expectation reduces anxiety, which makes communication smoother. That evening, I could feel that change clearly. The waiter approached the table. "Hey folks, how's it going tonight?" Emily answered naturally. "Good, thanks." Then he looked at me. "And for you?" "Good," I said comfortably. The interaction felt simple, almost effortless. Months earlier, I would have mentally translated each sentence before answering. Now the words flowed automatically. We ordered our meals and began chatting about the movie we had just watched. The conversation moved quickly, switching between opinions about the story and jokes about the characters. Halfway through the meal, Emily paused and looked around the room. "You seem really relaxed here," she said. "I feel different now," I admitted. "How so?" I thought about the question for a moment. When I first came to the United States, everything felt like a test, I explained. Every conversation. Every restaurant visit. Every simple task. "That makes sense," she said. "But now," I continued, "it feels more like normal life." That shift might sound small, but psychologically it's huge. Language learning experts explain that the biggest transition for many immigrants is the moment daily survival turns into everyday living. At first, every interaction requires intense concentration. Over time, the brain automates many processes. Ordering food, greeting people, making small talk, these actions become natural habits instead of stressful challenges. When the waiter returned with the bill, I glanced at the receipt with a small smile. This time, I knew exactly what to do. I picked up the pen, quickly calculated the tip, and wrote the number confidently. No hesitation. No confusion. Just understanding. Emily noticed. "Look at that," she said playfully. "A tipping expert." I laughed. Maybe not an expert. But at least I won't accidentally start a cultural mystery again. She leaned forward slightly. "You know something funny?" "What?" "If you hadn't made that mistake, we might never have had that conversation about tipping." She was right. That conversation had been the beginning of everything, our discussions about culture, language, and eventually the deeper connection that grew between us. Life sometimes hides opportunity inside embarrassment. Behavioral psychologists often call this reframing. When people look back at past mistakes and recognize the growth that came from them, the emotional meaning of those experiences changes completely. Instead of feeling ashamed, they begin to feel grateful. As we stood up to leave the restaurant, I looked around the room one more time. The place no longer felt like the setting of an awkward mistake. It felt like a landmark in my personal journey. Outside, the evening air felt cool and refreshing. Streetlights reflected softly on the sidewalk, and the city buzzed with its usual energy. Emily walked beside me quietly for a moment before speaking. You've come a long way, she said. From forgetting tips? I joked. From being new here, she replied. Her words made me realize something important. Language learning, cultural understanding, relationships, career growth, all of these things had been happening at the same time. And none of them followed a straight line. They grew through mistakes, curiosity, and small acts of kindness from strangers. That restaurant had once been the place where I felt confused and embarrassed. Now it felt like proof of progress. But the story still had one more lesson waiting. Because sometimes the smallest habit, something as simple as leaving a tip on a table, can quietly change the way you see an entire life journey. And that realization was about to become the final piece of this story. The real meaning behind the tip. By the time Emily and I stepped out of the restaurant that night, the streets were alive with the usual rhythm of the city. Cars rolled slowly past glowing storefronts. Groups of friends laughed as they searched for late-night desserts. Somewhere down the block, music spilled out from a bar, mixing with the distant sound of traffic. We walked side by side without saying much for a minute. Sometimes silence between friends feels uncomfortable. But sometimes it feels peaceful, like both people are thinking about the same thing without needing words. Emily finally broke the quiet. You know, she said, most Americans don't even think about tipping anymore. What do you mean? It's just automatic, she explained. People grow up seeing their parents do it. So when they start going to restaurants themselves, they never question it. That made sense. Cultural habits often work that way. When something is learned early in life, it becomes invisible. People follow the rule without remembering where it came from. But when you arrive from another country, those invisible rules suddenly become very visible. Back home, I said, tipping existed sometimes, but it wasn't expected everywhere. Right, Emily nodded. In the US, it's more connected to how restaurants work. She paused for a moment as we waited at a crosswalk. Servers here often depend on tips as part of their income. I had learned that months earlier, but hearing it again now felt different. At the beginning, I understood tipping simply as a rule to follow. Something you must remember to avoid awkward situations. But now I understood the human side of it. Behind every tip was a person. Someone who had spent the evening bringing plates, refilling drinks, and making sure guests had a comfortable experience. That small extra number on the receipt represented appreciation. When the crosswalk signal changed, we continued walking. Can I tell you something funny? I said. Sure. When I first moved here, I thought learning English meant memorizing vocabulary. Emily smiled. Most people think that. But now I realize it's much bigger than that, I continued. It's about understanding how people live. Language experts often describe this idea as cultural fluency. Knowing the words of a language is only the first step. True communication happens when someone understands the habits, values, and expectations that shape those words. Without that deeper understanding, conversations can still feel confusing. Emily looked thoughtful. You know, she said, I've actually learned things from you too. Like what? Like noticing cultural habits that I never questioned before. She laughed softly. When you asked why tipping existed, I had to think about it for the first time. That moment reminded me of something interesting about cross-cultural friendships. When two people from different backgrounds talk honestly about everyday customs, both sides begin seeing their own culture with new eyes. It becomes less automatic, more intentional. As we turned on to another street, we passed a small coffee shop that was closing for the night. Inside, employees were wiping tables and stacking chairs. One worker walked over to the counter where a glass tip jar sat beside the register. He emptied the bills and coins into a small container and smiled as he counted them. Emily noticed me watching. "Thinking about tipping again," she teased. "A little," I admitted. But my thoughts were different now. That jar represented something simple but powerful, the idea that small gestures add up. One customer leaves $1. Another leaves $2. By the end of the day, those tiny decisions become meaningful support for someone's work. In psychology, there's a concept called the micro-impact effect. It suggests that small actions, things that take only a few seconds, can create surprisingly large positive outcomes when repeated over time. Tipping is a perfect example. For the customer, it's a quick calculation. For the server, it can shape the entire day. We continued walking until we reached a quiet park bench near the corner. Emily sat down and stretched her legs. "So," she said, "what's the biggest thing you've learned since moving here?" That question was bigger than it sounded. So many things had changed since my arrival: my confidence, my friendships, my understanding of daily American life. But one idea stood out. "I've learned that mistakes are actually part of the process," I said slowly. Emily tilted her head. "Explain." "When I first forgot to tip, I felt embarrassed," I said. "But if that mistake never happened, I wouldn't have learned so much afterward." She nodded. "That's true. In language learning, people often try to avoid mistakes," I continued. "But mistakes are usually the moments when real learning happens." Research in language education supports that idea. Studies show that learners remember lessons more deeply when they make errors and then receive feedback. The brain treats those moments like important signals. It adjusts. It grows. Emily smiled thoughtfully. "You turned a tipping mistake into a life lesson." I laughed. Maybe I just needed a lot of help figuring things out. "Well," she said, standing up from the bench, "that's kind of how life works." As we started walking again, the city around us felt comfortable and familiar. Not perfect. Not completely understood. But familiar enough that it felt like home. And that's the final secret of cultural learning. It doesn't happen all at once. It grows slowly, through conversations, awkward moments, friendly explanations, and small acts of patience from the people around you. Sometimes it even begins with something as simple as forgetting to leave a tip. But if you stay curious, keep asking questions, and keep trying again, those small moments eventually become stories worth telling. Stories that remind us how learning a language is never just about words. It's about understanding people. A small habit that changed everything. A few weeks after that evening at the restaurant, I found myself thinking about tipping again, but this time in a completely different way. Not as a rule. Not as something I had to remember. But as a symbol of how much my life had changed since arriving in the United States. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when the realization happened. I had stopped at a small cafe near my apartment to grab coffee and do some work on my laptop. The place wasn't fancy. Just a cozy neighborhood spot with warm lights, soft music, and the smell of fresh espresso floating through the air. People sat at small tables reading, typing, or chatting quietly with friends. I ordered a coffee at the counter. The barista greeted me with an easy smile. "Hey. How's your day going?" "Pretty good," I said. Simple conversation. Natural. Effortless. A year earlier, even this short exchange would have required mental preparation. I would have rehearsed my sentence in my head before speaking. Now it happened automatically. When the barista handed me my drink, I noticed the small tip jar sitting beside the register. It looked almost exactly like the one Emily and I had seen in that coffee shop weeks earlier. Inside were a few dollar bills, some coins, and a folded piece of paper that read, "Tips are appreciated." I dropped a couple of dollars into the jar and took my coffee to a nearby table. As I sat down, something interesting crossed my mind. That small action, the simple act of leaving a tip, had quietly become part of my routine. No confusion. No hesitation. Just habit. Behavioral scientists explain that habits form through repetition and context. When a behavior happens regularly in the same environment, the brain eventually stores it as an automatic pattern. In other words, what once required effort becomes effortless. And that idea applies to more than tipping. It applies to language. It applies to culture. It applies to life in a new country. I opened my laptop and began working, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the journey of the past year. Moving to another country had felt overwhelming at first. Everything was unfamiliar. Simple tasks, ordering food, understanding jokes, making phone calls, felt like complicated puzzles. But over time, the puzzles became easier. Then they disappeared completely. Not because the world changed. Because I changed. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A young man walked into the cafe and approached the counter. From the way he spoke, I could tell English wasn't his first language. He looked slightly nervous. Coffee, he said slowly. The barista waited patiently. "What kind would you like?" The man hesitated. For a moment, the scene felt strangely familiar. I recognized that expression immediately, the small pause, the uncertainty, the effort to organize words quickly in a second language. I had been there many times. Finally he said, "Latte, please." "Great choice," the barista said kindly. "Hot or iced?" The man thought for a second. "Hot." The transaction finished smoothly, but I could still see a little tension in his shoulders as he stepped away from the counter. He looked around the cafe before sitting at a table nearby. When the barista placed the drink on the counter and called his name, the man walked over to pick it up. Then he noticed the tip jar. He froze for a moment. That tiny pause said everything. He wasn't sure what to do. The situation felt almost like watching a scene from my past. He checked his wallet quickly, then looked around as if searching for clues about the correct action. Finally, he placed $1 in the jar. Not confidently, but carefully. As if he was hoping he had made the right choice. When he returned to his table, he caught my eye for a brief second. There was a small look of relief on his face. And suddenly I understood something very clearly. Every immigrant goes through moments like this. Moments where the rules are invisible. Moments where you must guess what is normal. Moments where you quietly hope you didn't make a mistake. Those experiences can feel stressful while they're happening. But they also create something powerful. Empathy. Because once you've struggled through those small cultural puzzles yourself, you begin noticing when others are facing the same challenge. Later, as I packed up my laptop to leave, the barista waved goodbye. "See you next time." "See you," I replied. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the sidewalk, and people moved through the neighborhood at an easy weekend pace. I walked slowly toward my apartment, thinking about that moment in the cafe. That young man might never realize how familiar his situation looked to me. But it reminded me of something important. Learning a language is not just about grammar or pronunciation. It's about learning the quiet rules that shape everyday life. The unwritten habits. The tiny expectations that locals rarely notice. And sometimes, those lessons appear in the most ordinary places. A restaurant bill. A tip jar on a cafe counter. A short conversation with a stranger. Individually, these moments seem small. But together, they build understanding. They build confidence. They slowly turn a foreign place into something that feels like home. And one day, without realizing it, you become the person sitting calmly at the table, watching someone else go through the same learning journey you once experienced. That's when you realize something surprising. The story was never really about tipping. It was about growth. It was about patience. And most of all, it was about how small mistakes can quietly lead to big transformations. Sometimes all it takes is a simple moment, and the courage to keep learning from it. Final reflection, the lesson behind the tip. Sometimes the biggest life lessons hide inside the smallest moments. A forgotten tip on a restaurant bill might seem like nothing more than a minor mistake. Something embarrassing for a few minutes, and then quickly forgotten. But real life rarely works that way. Small moments have a strange power. They stay in our memory, quietly shaping the way we see the world. One awkward dinner can turn into a deeper understanding of culture. One confusing conversation can become the beginning of confidence in a new language. And sometimes, a simple tipping mistake can mark the first step of an entire journey. When people move to a new country, they often expect the biggest challenges to be obvious things: grammar, pronunciation, vocabulary. Those things matter, of course. But the real surprises usually come from everyday life. The unwritten rules. The silent expectations. The tiny cultural habits that everyone around you understands, except you. Those moments can feel uncomfortable at first. Sometimes even embarrassing. But they are also the moments where real learning begins. Because language is never just about words. Language is about people. It's about how people show respect. How they express appreciation. How they build trust through small gestures that outsiders might not immediately notice. In the United States, tipping happens to be one of those gestures. But the deeper lesson goes far beyond restaurant culture. It's about curiosity. The willingness to ask questions. The courage to keep learning even when things feel awkward. Every person who learns a new language, moves to a new country, or steps into an unfamiliar culture experiences moments like this. Moments where you pause and think, did I do that right? Those moments are not failures. They are progress. They are proof that you are stepping outside your comfort zone and discovering how the world works from a new perspective. And one day, almost without noticing, those confusing situations start to feel normal. You walk into a cafe and order coffee without thinking, You chat with strangers easily. You understand jokes that once felt impossible to follow. And yes, you leave the correct tip without hesitation. That's when you realize something important. The journey wasn't about avoiding mistakes. The journey was about growing through them. If you're currently learning English, adjusting to life in a new country, or simply trying to understand another culture better, remember this. Every small mistake is part of the story. Every awkward moment is a lesson. And every lesson brings you one step closer to confidence. Thank you for being part of this story. If this experience felt familiar to you, or if you're on your own journey of learning English and understanding American culture, then this channel was created for you. Here, we share real-life stories, cultural insights, and practical English that people actually use in everyday conversations in the United States. Because the best way to learn a language is not by memorizing textbooks. It's by understanding real life. So if you enjoyed this story and want more storytelling lessons that help you learn English naturally, understand American culture, and build real confidence in conversations, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Like this video to support more stories like this. And leave a comment below telling us, what was the most confusing cultural moment you've ever experienced? Your story might inspire the next lesson on this channel. And remember, sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest transformations.